I want to thank everybody for being here this morning. We're excited. This is the first webinar we put on here at Veda. So for those that are watching live, as well as those that'll be watching later, really appreciate your time. This will be the first of many, and we'll talk about that a little bit later this morning. But my name is Danny Blaylock. I'm the Chief Farm Operations Officer here at Veda. We're a company that specializes in regenerative agriculture, and our focus is right here in the Mississippi Delta. We have several customers and farms both in Arkansas and Mississippi. And we firmly believe that, with regenerative agriculture, you can absolutely increase and improve soil health at the same time that you improve profitability and efficiency. So one of the key things that we focus on is cover crops in our process, and that's what we'll be talking about this morning. Hopefully we'll go around and, with the topic we're talking about, hopefully as we go through, we'll answer some of the key questions that you may have on cover crops. This morning we've got Dr. TJ Bradford with us. Dr. Bradford has a ton of experience with cover crops, both in his previous life as well as his time here with Veda on our own operating farm. So with that, Dr. Bradford, I'll shoot it over to you and let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate it. It's good to be here this morning. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and see how everybody can see that. I don't know how weird I'm showing up on the screen. Am I showing up on the screen fine? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it's good to be here this morning with everybody. And as Danny said, I'm TJ Bradford, and my role is Director of Strategic Partnerships. Been here with the company right at about 2 years, and my prior role was Director of Agronomy. And so with that role, hands-on in the field with a lot of our prescriptions that we do, our cover crops, rates and things of all that nature, everything agronomy from a seed to the ground to variety selection. And so we have a great team of agronomists and a farm team that really helps us propel to what we do. So just a little background about me. So some people are on that may know me, they've known me for a while, but finished out my PhD at Mississippi State and was there for about 6 years as a faculty member in precision ag, helping start that program, build that program up. Prior to that, I was employed by the USDA as a soil conservationist and soil scientist, and went all over the country. And I was in Mississippi for a few years. I was in Wyoming, and I was in Pennsylvania and Florida, doing a lot of soil science work, a lot of soil mapping. The web soil survey lines that you see today had a hand in doing those and updating those. And I also grew up from Mississippi, so my family still farms in the Mississippi Delta. So I've been farming since the 1870s, and so farming is really just a part of who I am. And so I'm fortunate to be able to work with a company like Veda, where we have our presence in the Delta and really advancing these things going forward. So it's a great job, great. We do a lot of good things, have a lot of fun, and really putting these things on the ground. And I know we're going to be talking about a little aspect of our soil health, thing that we do, and cover crops is a part of that. And so I'm ready to jump into it. And some people may have submitted questions already. We may get to a few of those, but if we don't get to all of them, we'll have a space where you can send in your questions and we can try to touch base with everybody.
Yeah, so perfect. So we'll jump right in, TJ, and you and I know we're talking earlier this week. Of all the topics to talk to, cover crops may be kind of the most divisive for a lot of farmers. You've got guys that swear by them. You've got guys that think they could be a nightmare to their operation. You've got others that are on the fence and maybe are looking at trying cover crops. So spend a little time just talking why cover crops are important, why they're important to Veda, and why they're important to farming as a whole and soil health.
Yeah, I mean that, you mentioned it, Dan. I know we only got, about 30 minutes or so, and I can talk about cover crops, just this specific question for at least an hour. But, I like to say cover crops are literally like the Tim Tebow of topics when it comes to to agriculture. Either you love it or you hate it. I mean, I've found very few people that are in between, in with cover crops, and the reason I think that people have their experiences with cover crops or their opinions is but for a variety of reasons. So people have tried them and they say, well, they didn't work or they didn't grow. People have tried them and said, well, I didn't like the way that it looked. It looked like my field was full of weeds and I have a field right by the road and I don't want everybody looking to see my field looks weedy, but cover crops are a staple, kind of like in the soil health arena, as we want to improve aspects of our soil health. I mean, that it's kind of one of those ways where you kind of speed up the process. And I look at it as like cover crops is like a Swiss Army knife. They do so much. I mean, they're when we start to get down into the species selection and adaptation and planting timing. I mean, I'm a nerd, so I get excited about that kind of stuff. But cover crops, they do so much. I mean, to name a few, when we talk about mitigating soil erosion, I mean, just having the cover crop on the ground decreases that velocity of the raindrop before it hits the ground to transport any soil particles. And in the Mississippi Delta, where we have, some silty soils, some clay soils, the silty soils are the most erosive. And so we have to make sure that that cover being on the ground does a lot more than we kind of meet the eye because statistics show that cover crops, intercept about 80% of the raindrop that's falling and decreases that velocity, therefore decreasing the potential for that soil to erode. So that's just one. I mean, even you look at weed suppression here on that Veda farm. And, last year we planted, I think it was 90 pounds of cereal rye that were in East O2, I believe, or East O5, one of those East fields. But I mean, we were able to completely eliminate, a herbicide application just from that weed presence that was not there from that mat for the cover crops. So weed suppression is there. And when we talk about alleviating soil compaction without the mechanical approach of deep ripping and things of that nature, there are cover crop species that help alleviate that soil compaction. And you and I both know that if you can alleviate some aspect of soil compaction without carrying a machine across the ground, that's going to do so much. I mean, you're not aiding in compaction because you're not carrying a piece of equipment across. You're also, saving a pass across the field, so that saves diesel. And you can't pull that subsoiler at 50 miles an hour. So it's a tedious process. So it takes time away from doing other things. And then we'll talk about water availability later, but I mean, cover crops are literally like a Swiss Army knife. They do so many things and they do so many things well. I mean, I love cover crops. And like I said, in every situation, cover crops just, we have to make sure that they fit into the goals and the scheme and the operation. But I mean, they do so much, and it's like we have a plethora of options of what they can improve and help with.
Perfect. So TJ, a lot of folks have looked in and have noticed that cover crops have been grown in the Midwest for decades. And their cultural practices are quite a bit different than ours, of course. You've got minimal till, no till, strip till in areas where it may be easier to implement cover crops. How do you talk to farmers about implementing cover crops and those practices here in the Mississippi Delta, where again, our practices are quite a bit different. Our soils are a lot different, lots of heavy clay, heavy gumbo, and with our furrow irrigation process as well. So talk a little bit about how do you make cover crops fit here in the Delta?
I get that question a lot, Danny, and it's kind of like what you said. Most people, they think when you think cover crops, they don't think Mississippi Delta. They think Midwest, they think Nebraska and all that type of stuff. And here in the Delta, because like I said, I grew up here. It is one of those practices that's not widely adopted for a variety of reasons. When I was growing up, we would go out and we would till the ground just because there was nothing else to do. and in that situation, cover crops, they are not going to survive, with that type of mindset from what we did growing up. But most people do think, hey, this is a Midwest thing. This is not a Southern thing. This is not a Southeast type of thing. But we are starting to see the adoption of cover crops um, tick up because of some of the ways that we think about how do we get these species adapted to the Delta. And I look at it as this thing, and if some of my former students are on, they'll know this saying I say it all the time, doing the right thing at the right place at the right time. And that is the key for adopting cover crops to this area. That's how we unlock that. And so some of the things that we look at is, which species to plant. And now I will say it this time, I said all the time, cover crops are not created equal. They do so many great things in so many different ways, but we have to make sure that we put them in a space where they can thrive. You know, most people like to grow certain cover crops that are in the Midwest or in the Northwest that are good species on paper, but then when you take them off paper and put them in the ground here in the Southeast, they don't work as well. And so with our climates, we have to select species that adapt well to the warmer climates that are going to aid in establishment. Grasses are phenomenal cover crop species here in the Southeast because even when we're planting cover crops, like now or getting ready to plant the next month in October, we still have those heat units that can be accumulated where those grasses can grow and thrive and they can get a lot of biomass on them in a very short amount of time before we start getting the cooler weather to kind of slow those grasses down. Even in with some of our legumes and some of our forbs, the brassicas, we have such an extended growing season in the South that we have a lot of issue. I mean, we have a lot of potential, because when you can grow brassicas in the fall and the spring, I mean, that just opens up so much of what you can do. Um, and a lot of these brassicas are good for compaction issues. And so then we think about, the timing of establishment and termination, because we have such a large window, and in the mid-South, we get a lot of our rain, especially in Mississippi, we get a lot of our rain in the wintertime. And when these plants are actively growing in the cooler weather, we get species that can adapt longer in the wintertime. They can grow and thrive in the wintertime. That should go into a part of when can we terminate. So you have a little bit more of a leeway to establish a little bit later. Now, we're not talking about establishment late November, but we're talking about, mid-October to where we can still get good biomass for them in the spring without negatively impacting our crop coming in. And then, with our moisture, like I mentioned, we get a lot of rain in the winter and sometimes in the fall, not counting the last two falls, but we typically get quite a bit of moisture. And with our humidity here, the evapotranspiration potential is a little bit lower. And so we have to make sure we utilize that water because it's not evaporating like it would be in the summertime. And cover crops really help that. And there are species that are deep rooted that can really go down to the ground and get that water off of there. And then we have to take note of our soil properties, like you mentioned, we got the gumbo clay, the alligator clay, the clay that I say that, if you walk in the field, you get taller with every step because it just sticks to your boots. But we have to look at cover crops that are adapted to these heavy soil types that we just don't get everywhere else in the world. And I like to say in Mississippi, we're special. We're really special here in the South. But all these things go into a great cover crop plan so we can identify which species work well and which species we can get the most out of.
Yeah, so that's great, TJ. And this is a huge point I think for everybody out there that just to add some layers onto this and what you're saying here with the three R's is cover crops, one, they're not a silver bullet by themselves, but also with cover crops, it's definitely not a one size fits all. So as we look at cover crops, as folks are looking at, hey, what should they do? Maybe they're taking advantage of some government programs that are out there, there are some great programs through NRCS, which can help cost share some of this. How do you make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck with a cover crop program when we're looking at all these different things that go into it, because there's a lot of layers and a lot of really questions that you got to ask yourself as a grower as you're developing your own cover crop program. So, what specific factors do you look at, TJ, when you're making those cover crop decisions?
Man, that is that's kind of a loaded question, but it's a good question because it's a real question. And I think having real life scenarios and real life questions around these type of agronomic decisions really is going to help shape our mind with how we view these decision making when it comes to cover crops. And it's not a one question answer, if you know what I mean. It's not a, hey, we got this soil type, we need to plant this cover crop, or we got this crop coming in after we got to plant this cover crop. It's a whole bunch of questions. And what that kind of looks like is, outside of the species adaptation with what I should plant on this field, which is the largest question that you are faced with as a producer or as a landowner of what getting the right species on that field, but it's also about what rate, what rate should I go? Because, sometimes, more is not better, sometimes less is more, especially when you look at these cover crop interactions and how, so I give you an example. When I look at certain species, as far as cover crop mixes, I look at how these species grow and at which rate they grow at, because if we have a grass species that's going to grow very quickly and it's going to really outcompete the other mixes, the other species in that mix, it may not be best to go at a super high rate because they're going to be negatively impacted by just the benefit of the cover crop species growing. So we have to look at that specific rate and that interaction. When I think about things like brassicas, when I plant those in mixes, depending on where we're planting those at, depending on when we're planting and potential rain that we're getting ready to get, and depending on potential slope, I want to put those brassicas out there because they're going to grow fast, they're going to grow quick. Those leaves are going to cover the ground. So with any rain that's going to come in, it's going to decrease the amount or the potential of erosion to happen. And so it really depends on, the slope of the field for some of these species. When do you need to be planted by? And then also, how much is this going to cost? That's a huge question because it's like, hey, I'm not planting cover crops now, and I want to think about planting cover crops. Well, now I have another added expense to, per acre to make this work. And is that added expense of all these things that we say cover crops are going to benefit, is that added expense going to make sense for me? How do I optimize that added cost, that added expense, because that's some of the important factors that we have to look at. And then of course, what will the weather look like? Nobody can predict the weather, but at the same time, what we do at Veda, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, we take account into some of the trends that we have had over the past 100 years, data that we look at. And, all of these things, are they worth it with the added benefits? So it takes on a lot of decisions. And the way that I look at it is I take it in kind of stages. And so because I'm a nerd, because I love digging holes, I love, analyzing, classifying soils, I'm gonna start with the soil series. That's where I'm starting. I'm digging a hole. I'm looking at soil aggregation. I'm looking at all these things. I'm looking at texture. I'm looking at potential for fertility options as far as like what is this cover crop going to scavenge. I'm looking at these physical properties, I'm looking at all of that. And I'm also looking at prior management because management is one of those things where with cover crops, you have to shift in a management philosophy sometimes. But it's a good thing because anybody can adopt a management philosophy. And then I have to take those things and I say, okay, well, how is that going to aid in looking at, the prescription for this field, the rate, doing the right thing at the right place at the right time? What are our goals? What do we want to see? Do we want to have biomass for weed suppression, or do we want to have erosion control? Do we want to have increased water infiltration, soil aggregate, all these type of things? And then you compare that with, well, now that I have cover crops, how much time do I want to spend in the field? Because now I have an added time to get these cover crops out, to monitor them, to manage them, and what are they going to be used for? And as I was mentioning about, the species, the cover crop species, if you look at this illustration, you can see how all three of these species, the legumes, the grasses and the forbs, the brassicas, how they do different things. And just from a root growth situation, you can see that the grasses are fantastic for root growth. So they're going to be great for scavenging. Legumes, we know they're going to supply nitrogen, but they aren't good for weed suppression and competition. And they are the ones that's going to be easily choked out. And then because of the brassicas with their root system, that's where we're going to get a lot of that soil aggregation as well, because those root hairs, that's going to increase the capacity for that plant to really draw in water and nutrients and infiltrate. And then when you have them together, you get all the benefits. And that's why we look at a multitude of species and doing the right thing at the right place at the right time, in these fields when it comes to cover crops.
So TJ, to bolt on to that point, one thing that we've discovered on our farm, and you've been a great help with this and helping us kind of understand this more and how it's so field specific. But how important is it that, as a grower, you're honest with yourself, not only about what you're looking for to get out of cover crops, but also on the front end, you got to be really honest about what are my pressures within the field? What are the weed pressures that I see, and how does that affect some of your cover crop recommendations possibly?
Fantastic question. And that is really one of the questions that I start with growers, with farmers in the area that we consult with, ask them about, of course, their goals. Hey, what goals do you want to see? What goals for your farm do you want to see? Whether it's, increasing water efficiency. But then we get into the questions about what is the state? And I talk about weeds because weeds are one of the most limiting factors um, in a growing operation. And when it comes to cover crops and weed dynamics, here's the thing: the weeds that we have the most trouble with grow at the same time that the cover crops grow. So when we think about our, Roundup resistant, ryegrass, they're coming up at the same time our cover crops are coming up. And so we have to look at that on the front end, because you can actually decrease the effectiveness of your desired species by ignoring or not having a real life example of what these troublesome species are. So because if we go out and plant cover crops, some fields that we have here at the Veda farm, we had to make a decision when it comes to cover crops, or do we, do a fall burn down to control this for the next year, and so if we would have gone in and went, wild with the cover crops, we wouldn't have gotten a response, because that Roundup resistant ryegrass would have already been there and growing. And then in the spring, now we have double the trouble, because now we have to terminate the ryegrass that's resistant and terminate the desired species that we want. So, weed pressure is really big, and we really have to look at that on the front end to assess where we actually are. So that's a great question.
Yeah, that's great. Well, this next point that I want you to talk about a little bit is probably the one that, I think is really, really coming top of mind to a lot of growers, and just, a lot of people in the communities up and down the Mississippi River, as we've set, record lows 2 of the last 3 years on the Mississippi River. And lots of attention are turning towards, irrigation and water management. And this is something we've seen on our farms with cover crops that is probably one of the biggest thing that pops out, and you can kind of see firsthand is how cover crops really, affect irrigation management and moisture within the field. So, if you could take a little time and talk through that, even though I'll say this is probably one of the harder things to measure, and I know you'll probably speak to that as well, but it's something you can see with your eyes. Not with the other elements of cover crops. There's so much going on below the ground, but with the moisture and the rain and the ability to possibly put off irrigation practices, this is one of the things that really has popped for me over the last several years using cover crops. So Talk a little bit about this, TJ. How do cover crops help with water management in the Delta?
Man, and this is a very important topic because what we want to do, especially at Veda, is we want to make sure that we are using water efficiently. You know, Cover crops aren't going to, take all of our reliance of water out of the equation simply because of where we are in the mid-south. I mean, we're in subtropical region. We get, high heat, high humidity in the summertime. I mean, it's just there's a lot going on, and 80% of the 80% of the Mississippi Delta is irrigated essentially. And, a lot of that is furrow irrigated, which is scientifically, it's not me speaking, it's scientifically speaking, is an inefficient use of irrigation water because of all the dynamics that are happening below the ground, things that we can't control essentially. But cover crops help with this because what it does for the soil from the physical aspect helps infiltrate and utilize that water effectively. And so, when you think about the root systems as they go into the ground, a lot of things are going to happen. These roots are going to create these channels. These roots are going to create space, these pore space for things to happen. And what it does is when that rain hits the ground or when that water hits the ground, it helps it infiltrate through and infiltrate in a way that the soil can then uh, fill capacity, but also supply water for the plants. Typically, what happens because with silty soils, they crust, water hits it, and it looks like it's infiltrating, but it's just getting wet, and the rest of it is shooting off. And then we have soil, we have nutrients, we have all the things that makes the soil better going off into the tail ditch. Um, and one of the things that I really love to do to talk about cover crops is look at the dynamics of what's happening between areas with cover crops and without cover crops and how these cover crops really help. And so when we talk about soil aggregation, we just talk about how well the soil clumps. And I remember doing this with a friend of mine who's part of our Soil Plus offering. We went out and we dug holes because that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna dig holes. We went out and dug holes and we looked at the soil aggregation in the spot, and it looked like the soil was clumping a decent amount. But what I did was I took a bottle of water, I cut it in half, I put that soil in that bottle of water, and in 4 seconds, the soil disintegrated. That soil is not helpful, and that's where the irrigation water is going. And so that is breaking up. It's not holding anything, so the plant can't get it. So the ground is getting wet, but the plant isn't getting it. But then we go to an area that has cover crops or an area that has good aggregation. You dump it in that same bottle of water, and 2 minutes later, it still formed a nice clod that when you crack it open, you can see wet spots and dry spots. That's what cover crops are going to do for that. They're going to help hold that soil together so that the plants can take up what it needs to take up. And here on the farm, we have our research area. We're called our sandbox area where we get to play. We experimented with this areas with cover crops and no cover crops, and there was a significant difference in the percent of aggregates, micro aggregates, macro aggregates from areas with even two different mixes treatments of cover crop. One for corn, one for soybean. But what happened was is we see a significant difference in the amount of how that soil aggregates, which goes to show that compared with no cover crops, the soil really doesn't have a shot. And think about what it does to the nutrients that are being held there in that soil particle that the plants can now take up. A light bulb should go off and be like, man, like I wonder how much better efficiently with my nutrients I can be just by being more efficient with the water. And we've done our infiltration test and done our average soil moisture content with our probes. And on the same ground, areas with cover crop, like literally 50 feet from each other, areas with cover crops with no cover crops, we did our infiltration rate. Within 6 minutes, we were able to infiltrate 3 inches of water. With areas with no cover crop, it takes about 19, 20 minutes. And even further, areas that I did even 2 years ago, there were times where with areas with no cover crop, that it took 39 minutes to infiltrate 1 inch of water. And I mean, that's insane. And literally same soil texture, same soil type with cover crops, less than 10 minutes. I mean, that when you think about rain and trying to get in the field in the spring, the ground is a little bit cooler because bare soil warms a little bit faster than covered soil. But when you're talking about the spring rains that we get here in the South and getting that water off of there to get back in the field, I mean, game changer.
Awesome. So TJ, I know you and I could talk about this for days. You could definitely provide classes on this, and get people some credit hours if they wanted it. But for those that are watching and maybe have more questions or their interest is piqued, talk a little bit. How can Veda help? How can our Soul Plus program help those folks that they want to take this step, but maybe they've still got some questions? So walk us through that really quick.
We there are a lot of things as a company that we do, and I'm biased a little bit, because I feel like we have an Avengers cast of agronomists and soil scientists and tech people, just everybody, But when we talk about our Soil Plus offering and getting this prescription right, you don't want to have to guess at your cover crops and prescription. And so we use a lot of data, and I'm talking hundreds of years of data, climatic data, weather data that go into really making these things count and making these things work. Just from a cover crops perspective. Now we're talking cover crops. I mean, I was part of helping build that tool, and I know what it took to get that tool off the ground because a lot of my brain is in that tool. And when you think about things like, soil drainage, soil texture, compaction, weed pressure, highly erodible land, land that may not be as marginal lands, timing, termination rate, plant timing, like all these things, we capture that information, we capture that data, and working one-on-one with the farmer, working one-on-one with the producer to see their goals and their needs and their desires and how can we make this work. We even go down to what equipment are you working with to make this happen. So we really get down in the weeds with not eliminating the guesswork of cover crops, and not just cover crops, but as you mentioned in other webinars that we'll have, the guesswork of a lot of other soil health aspects. And my funny thing is I want to take the hell out of soil health. I don't want it to be hellish, because it's we desire to do the same thing. We desire to be, to conserve our resources. We desire to be efficient and to be more productive and profitable without sacrificing yield to make these things happen. And because of the data, and we've seen it, we haven't had to sacrifice yield in making these decisions, which I'm excited about because we get more benefit with what we're doing with the same amount of time that everybody else gets. And I think that's the perfect avenue for our proving ground farms is that, hey, we get to do it. And I know you'll probably, you give the call to action about what's next, but I tell farmers all the time, I say you can do three things. You can take this information and you can do nothing. You can take this information and you can do it alone, or you can get some help. And like I said, I'm a little biased, but I know that what we do here at Veda is we provide that tailored plan. There's not a one size fits all plan, and we provide that tailored plan to actually take the guesswork out of these decisions.
Perfect. TJ, this has been great again, and I appreciate you and all the knowledge. And know we're just scratching the surface a little bit on just even just this one topic this morning. But I want to say thanks again for those who are viewing this and taking time out. We understand how valuable your time is, so appreciate you taking the time to watch this. Hopefully, you found some items that can improve your current practices or maybe push you over the edge a little bit to try some of these practices. We would love to help you with that. We're a little bit over, so we've seen a few questions come in this morning. We will absolutely get back to you with those. If maybe you haven't submitted a question, but you have one, please send your questions to ask@veda.com. We'll absolutely get back with you. Would love to work with you, answer some questions there. For those that just want to learn more about our Soul Plus program, and we've got reps on the ground, not only myself and TJ, we've got farm teams as well as two reps that are out that are always talking to growers about Soil Plus and what we have to offer with that program. Would love to set up time with you, not only to answer questions, but help you with some of these programs like TJ was saying. Do that. Reach out to us at veda.com at Soil Plus. And then lastly, we're on multiple social media platforms like most companies have to be today. So I know that's how some of you probably found us this morning. Feel free to follow us there. Would love to have you as a follower there on any of these platforms. Like I mentioned earlier, this will be the first of many webinars we'll do across different topics, throughout the fall, throughout the winter. Also, you'll get to watch us as we go through harvest in both Mississippi and Arkansas and kind of watch our progress there as well. So thank you again. Very appreciative for your time this morning. Wish everybody a very safe and bountiful harvest. And then until we see you on the next one, for both TJ and I, thank you very much and have a great day.